Hi, welcome to HP at Church's Good Friday episode for 2019. This episode may sound strangely familiar, perhaps oddly like the Good Friday episode from 2018. Pastor Emily and I looked at the Revised Common Lectionary scripture passages for Good Friday, which are the same every year, and looked at what we had said about them last year, and came to the same conclusion. We nailed it. So, please enjoy our Good Friday episode, now with added subtitles on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can find us at hpatchurch at patreon.com. Enjoy! Welcome to HP at Church. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they and them.
In this episode, we'll discuss the readings for Good Friday. In our previous episode, we discussed Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday.
Our blog is hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in the entries for these episodes.
So, if you're not familiar, what is Good Friday? Good Friday is when we tell the story of Jesus' trial and death by crucifixion. We'll be reading the 2 chapters of John that tell that story. So, if you're reading the scripture passages along with us, please know that the readings for this episode are pretty heavy and involve some gore. But our conversation about these readings won't dwell on that.
Also, one thing of note is that there is a word in the Greek that comes up a lot, particularly in the Gospel of John, and that word is Judaios. And in a lot of versions of the Bible, they translate that as Jews or Jewish people, and it can actually mean a variety of different things. It can mean Jewish people, it can mean Judeans, so residents of that particular region, and it can even mean the religious authorities that were there. Historically, the Gospel of John and the Passion, which is what we sometimes call these stories for Good Friday, has been used in anti-Semitic ways to scorn Jewish people, to blame Jewish people for the crucifixion, those sorts of things. We think it's really important that everybody knows that Jesus was, in fact, Jewish. So when we talk about Jewish people, when we talk about Judeans, when we talk about religious authorities, we're talking about Jesus' own people and the community that Jesus identifies with. And as Christians, we identify with Jesus. So we will do our best throughout this podcast to use the word that fits the best. And then if you go find it in the Bible somewhere, make sure that you're aware when you see something that says Jews that it might mean Jewish people, but it could also mean people of that region, Judeans, or even religious authorities.
So, on that note, here we go. Our first reading for Good Friday is from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, through chapter 53, verse 12. This is another servant song from Isaiah, and this passage tells us that the servant's sacrifice of his life is successful and brings about forgiveness of sin.
So the beginning of this passage, particularly verses 14 and 15, really remind me of people's reactions to Mad-Eye Moody in Book 4. So verse 14 starts out and says, "Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals." And when Mad-Eye Moody first appears in Book 4, Harry, in particular, as our narrator, remarks and is astonished by his looks. There's a chunk missing from his nose, he has a magical eye, he has a lot of really heavy scarring, and so it's startling to Harry to see Mad-Eye Moody for the first time.
And the Harry Potter books, maybe because they're so centered on teenagers,
gives us a lot of examples of people whose lives are directly impacted by the way they look. And many people whose lives are made more difficult, or people who are actually harmed because of their appearance. If you want to jump back to the Marauders era, Snape as a teenager, his appearance didn't help, certainly. Neville, especially when he was younger, whether you're talking about the books or the movies, the actor was chosen because when they started out, he was short and round and not impressive looking. And then, of course, how that actor grew up, no one really expected, and yet it wound up fitting his character and the character growth that J.K. Rowling gave him very nicely. Even Hermione spends a lot of time having assumptions made about her based on her hair, her teeth, and so on, which is why, for her especially, but also for the way it affected the people around her, Victor being so interested in her in the fourth book is such a big thing, because no one had seen her as attractive before. And that enabled her to see herself in a whole new way, and enabled some of the people around her, Ron, to realize that maybe she was also worth that kind of attention.
Yeah, and that ties in really well also to how we read the books in general and how we read the Bible in general, right? The assumptions that we make about the characters and the people that we find in both of those books. So there's not textual evidence for Hermione being white or for Lavender Brown being white. And yet, when Lavender or Hermione are portrayed as black, white fans frequently, not all, obviously, but a lot of white fans get really, really upset because they've created an image for Hermione and Lavender as white. But really, all we know about Hermione is that she has bushy hair, big front teeth, and she's really dark after she spends the summer after the second book on vacation. And Lavender Brown, in fact, was portrayed by a black actress in the beginning of the Harry Potter movies, and then as her role got bigger, they switched it, and there was a white actress playing her. And so that's an important thing always to think about, is how we perceive people, particularly in literature, particularly in movies. We tend to add whiteness to people or whitewash different characters. And we do that with Jesus, right? Jesus was an Arab. Jesus was Palestinian. Jesus was not white. But if you go into maybe even the majority of Christian churches, look at the majority of Christian artwork, especially from a European or North American context, Jesus is portrayed very much as a white person, which just doesn't make sense with actual history.
And in some of the worst offenders, he's also blonde, which just boggles the mind. But anyway. Harry Potter fandom isn't innocent of this either. One of the most interesting things about the books in the early years is that Blaise Zabini, a Slytherin in Harry's year, is mentioned off and on in the early books, but there's never a pronoun applied to Blaise in the early books. You don't get a pronoun for Blaise, you don't actually get to see anything about what Blaise looks like until book 7. Fandom, in terms of those writing fan fiction, before book 7 was published, was pretty equally split on was Blaise a boy, was Blaise a girl. If she was a girl, she was almost always a redhead because there weren't enough redheads in the books, because I don't know, it's like there aren't enough Weasleys. Anyway. Or maybe they just wanted a counterpart. If Blaise was a boy, then Blaise was almost always white. I don't know, this could be just my perception, but it seemed like most of the fan fiction I read had Blaise being a girl. Possibly because fandom was really interested about the idea of Draco having all of these girls to interact with in the Slytherin dormitory. Thank you, fandom. When J.K. Rowling revealed that not only was Blaise a boy, but Blaise was black, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle in Harry Potter fandom. My memories of that time are not vivid enough to be able to give you a rundown, but if you wander through the old live journals, if they still exist, or some of the old websites from the time around the release of Book 7, you will find that many people were a little surprised. And certainly his mother's history of being a woman who married several rich men and they all died under mysterious circumstances, and the phrase Black Widow got used in awkward ways. That was a big conversation, too.
Also, Tonks is one of my favorite characters for this as well, because Tonks is a metamorph magus, and I have interpreted Tonks as being very much genderqueer, right? She can change her body, and while there are particular pronouns that are used in the books, we know that they're, the perspective of Harry Potter, who's never met anybody who's genderqueer as far as we know up to this point. And so I think about that. I think about that also because I understand Remus and Sirius to be in a relationship in books, primarily in book 4 and 5. And so then people are like, yeah, but then Tonks, and that's not possible. Well, A, bisexuality is a thing, and let's just name that and recognize that. But also, Tonks as genderqueer fits really well into that she can have a different body if she wants a different body. And so I love that way of playing with representation and playing with people's expectations to creatively kind of read ourselves into the books. In this past February, Black Girls Create was participating in Black Wizard History Month for February, for Black History Month. And it's fantastic. I've been following it on Twitter, but you can go on a variety of different places, and we'll include a link to Black Girls Create in our blog post notes. But it's fantastic to just see the different representations of Harry Potter characters as Black. It's so powerful. And I think, especially as we think about, in this episode, Jesus as the crucified one, as the one who takes on the suffering of the whole world, we also need to think about how we image Jesus. And if Jesus truly is the crucified one, then, as James Cone said, Jesus was Black. Jesus was an immigrant without papers. Jesus is queer, right? All of these things are part of who Jesus is and how Jesus embodies true humanity by becoming those of us who are most marginalized and most oppressed and who suffer the most in society.
I don't remember who said it to me first, but I do firmly have the memory of someone saying that if you're dividing the world into us and them, and you're asking yourself, which side is Jesus on? Jesus is always on the side with less power. Jesus is always on the side with less everything. Jesus is always on the side that's hurting more. And therefore, as Christians, we are called to acknowledge that and to always be ready to help those in need.
Yep.
Moving on, we certainly do see that in the Harry Potter books, just like in the servant song in Isaiah, the servant is known. He was despised and rejected by others. He wasn't special. He's not the kind of person that you would expect to come up and do these amazing things. In the same way, Harry and his friends spend a fair amount of the books, especially in the early years before Harry really starts making a name for himself other than the boy who lived. They're often assumed to be incompetent, mostly because they're young.
Mm-hmm.
And with Molly Weasley in particular, through the books, it's hard for her to see her children, and I would totally include Harry on that list.
Mm-hmm.
She adopts him pretty firmly, and he needs that, and that's good. But it's hard for her to see her children as her co-workers in the Order.
Yeah.
Not only because they're her children and she's very protective toward them, but also because she's known them since they were born. She has the stories of the ridiculous stuff that they pulled off when they were 6, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for her to look at these people and not see them as the infants that they once were. And those of us who have had those moments with our own families can certainly acknowledge that that is a thing that happened. We also had the line in passage saying, by a perversion of justice he was taken away and cut off. Oh, look, it's Harry Potter! Taken away from the wizarding world, taken away from the people who loved him, and given instead to the blood relatives who couldn't stand him, and put in a world that had no special love for him.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's certainly a parallel there. Harry does always seem to parallel with Jesus. And then finally, and I think one of the most difficult parts of this passage, and something that brings us into one of the most difficult conversations we can ever have about religion, particularly the Christian religion, but I've had these conversations with people of other religions as well. We have this line in the passage in Isaiah, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain."
Yeah.
We all have trouble with lines like that. I don't want to worship a God who does that kind of thing. That's not what I'm here for. That's not why I sought a life of religious service. That's not the God I talk about. But we have to address this head on. We can't ignore this question. And even people who are members of a church, they will ask this question too. Is this horrible thing that happened to me something that God did? Is this God testing me? Is this God trying to teach me? Did God do all of this stuff to Harry? I mean, yes, okay, fictional, but if it was real, was it God who allowed Harry's parents to be killed and then allowed these horrible things to happen? I am a cradle Christian. I am a cradle Lutheran. Basically, I was raised that way. I was baptized when I was 6 months old. I have never not been in the church. I have gone through a couple of periods of extreme doubt where I would say that I was definitely agnostic, a 1 year period at one point, and then again for another 1 year period at another point in my life. But the way that I look at these questions is certainly colored by my history with the church. Not all of which has been positive, but I have also never been abused.
Yeah.
As a mentor once put it, I have not been abused. I have occasionally been pruned a little bit too enthusiastically, but I would not call it abuse. It's not that I don't know that the church doesn't have its flaws. The people of the church are no better than the people of any other group. But there's a difference between being angry at the church and being angry at God. And some people are angry at both. I do always say that you can't be angry at God and not believe in God at the same time.
Truth.
You can totally be angry at the church and not believe in God. I've met a lot of people like that too. But the way that you address these questions with someone who does have that faith, even if they're not happy about it right now, and the way you address it with people who don't, is a little different. There's a different kind of, I would call it pastoral care involved. Since this podcast may be listened to by people from both points of view, I want to put this as gently as I can. Why does evil exist if God is omnipotent and loves us? How can evil be here? There are two conversations I tend to have. One is when we talk about evil, we can't just talk about the stuff that happened to you personally. I understand that it might be your grandmother's death that led you to asking these questions and being tied up in these knots and yelling at God. And hey, yelling at God is an ancient Christian tradition. Go for it, man.
I mean, check out any of the Psalms, right? Like,
yeah,
they're fantastic.
And actually, the prophets, Jeremiah is the longest book in the Bible, mostly because he was really, really angry, but he wasn't just angry at the Israelites, he was also angry at God, for good reason. So yeah, if you want a guide on how to yell at God, the Bible is a great source. But if you want to talk about evil in the world, we can't talk about just what happened to you. We have to talk about the bigger issues. We have to talk about what does this mean about natural disasters. We have to talk about what does this mean about murder victims. We have to talk about what does this mean about genocide victims. We have to talk about what does this mean about people who died from poverty over the last thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Almost never are any of these big questions just about you and your life specifically. They're always bigger than that.
And that's part of Christianity, right? Is that it's not an individualistic faith, no matter how it's been kind of twisted and turned over the millennia. But Christianity is about a community of faith. It's about the whole body of Christ.
Right. And the second conversation that I always try to have when we're talking about, did God do this? Does God want us to suffer? Why do all these bad things happen? The second question is, if you want to change the world so this stuff doesn't happen, exactly what do you mean by that? If you want a world without evil, if you want a world without unnecessary suffering, you have to get bogged down in the particular question. Because you can say that you just want a world without suffering, but that also involves God, presumably, changing major scientific laws. I mean, natural disasters happen because that's how the current scientific setup works. If you want a world without natural disasters, geology is going to change in a big way. The meteorologist will have to relearn all kinds of stuff. We're not going to have tornadoes anymore. So if you want to say, well, okay, natural disasters, that's science, we can live with that, that's fine. But let's just get rid of murder. Well, okay, there's like 47 different kinds of murder on the law books right now. Different degrees, there's manslaughter. Are we going to include deaths by drunk driving? That kind of thing.
I think for me, a lot of this, too, comes back to free will, right? That we believe that we have free will. That's one of the gifts that God has given us. The way that I think about evil is as a twisting of good. So free will is a good thing. Similarly, being proud of yourself and your family and the place that you come from is good. But twisting that into nationalism, into demonizing other countries, into calling other countries terrible things, is not
interracial prejudice,
right? Is not good. And so I think about that I think a lot of evil that we witness in the world can be traced back to something that at its heart is not necessarily evil, but has been twisted to be evil.
And a lot of it can be traced back to stuff that at heart isn't from God. It's from us.
Yeah.
Scientific studies have shown that we have plenty of resources to feed the whole world. There's some transportation issues, but we could certainly get it done if that was our number one priority. We don't. I don't think we can talk about, is God doing this to us, until we explore the question of what would the world look like if we were actually as loving and kind to one another without limits as God has done to us.
So as a queer person particularly, and as a feminist, I carry a healthy dose of a hermeneutic of suspicion, which is a way of interpreting the Bible that's also suspicious about how it has been used, and who has written it, who has used it, who has abused it. And I think part of it, too, is understanding the historical, cultural context for things. But also, when Isaiah states, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain, we have to ask, was it, or is that our human understanding saying, we can't figure out a better explanation, so we're going to blame it on God? And I think that really matters, because that's been used a lot against queer people in particular, against people of African descent in this country during slavery, to justify slavery, all of these different things that we want to blame God because it's easier to just say it's God's fault and it gets us off the hook. But like you were saying, a lot of this is really our fault.
Our fault, our most grievous fault. Hey, look, it's Ash Wednesday again. So this is certainly not a question we're going to answer in the course of this podcast, or at least not without, several more episodes and never actually getting to the rest of Good Friday.
And I think one of the other parts of this, right, that maybe is helpful in understanding this is, like you mentioned, Harry is a lot of times made to be the Jesus figure in the Harry Potter series, and Dumbledore is frequently portrayed or analogized as God. And that's super problematic, right? And so when we think about that, and when we want to chalk things up to Dumbledore or to God, or to say, this is clearly Dumbledore's behind all of this and it's a great thing, and that is problematic. And so when we think about what we credit to God or blame on God, I think sometimes it might even be helpful to say, well, is this like a Dumbledore situation where it's just easier to say it's Dumbledore than to say it's God? Or is this really something that God is up to?
So we acknowledge that we're not going to fully answer this question, at least not without several more episodes. And at that rate, we would never get to the rest of Good Friday. So we hope that we have addressed this topic with the levity necessary and with everything we can bring to the table. But I think it's probably time for us to move on.
Speaking of which, our psalm for Good Friday is Psalm 22. And while we don't often cover psalms for this podcast, Psalm 22 is one of the more well-known psalms, particularly because Jesus quotes this psalm while on the cross, asking why he's been abandoned. And so we figured we'd tackle it as well. The beginning of Psalm 22 actually made me think of Wormtail, Peter Pettigrew, in wondering what he thinks about himself and how he has viewed himself throughout his lifetime in order to betray his friends the way he did. I don't know that he ever got to the end of the psalm, to the commitment to praise, but I think it's interesting to think about Psalm 22 and how Wormtail could have thought about him.
One of the things that we do need to remember about Psalm 22 is that while it does go to some dark places, it doesn't end there. There are many lament psalms in the Bible, and almost all of them end on some kind of positive note. The person uses the psalm to work through their grief, work through their anger, work through their questioning, and at the end comes back to trusting God. And this psalm is no different.
Mm-hmm. That's one of my favorite things, actually, about Psalms of Lament, is that they create space to lament, to have serious words with God about the situation that we're in, and it still moves into a space of trust and of praise for God.
The modern American pop culture idea of what Christianity is not in line with the history of Christianity. For millennia, the idea of being able to yell at God, being angry at God, lamenting and grieving at God for what God is perceived to have done to you, all of that was not only accepted but normal as a part of your faith life.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this idea in the American pop culture understanding of Christianity that you're not allowed to be angry or sad at God. And there are even people who try to discourage folks from grieving the death of their loved ones. Because if those loved ones are with God now, then you don't really have anything to grieve about. Well, no, of course you have something to grieve about. You've lost someone you love. That's huge. But even given the fact that the people of biblical times, the people that the Psalms come from, lived very hard, very difficult lives, as I think it's Thomas Hobbes who calls it nasty, brutish, and short. Even then, their lament psalms come back around to trusting in God once again. And I think it's an important point that Jesus chose one that does come back around to say from the cross. And that says something about where Jesus was when he was on the cross. When it comes to parallels for this mood of everyone has trusted you, I have always trusted you, but you're not helping me, I feel forsaken right now.
Mm-hmm.
And comparing that to the Harry Potter books and asking, is there a parallel there? There are two people who come to mind for me for that idea, Snape and Dumbledore. Snape was an Order member and a spy, and he was trusted by everyone who Harry trusted. But Harry couldn't trust him because Snape was also so abusive toward him and those he cared about. Harry finds himself a couple of times in the books basically saying to himself or to Snape or to people about Snape, I know everyone trusts him, but I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not helping me the way that I need to be helped. I think that's a good parallel for Psalm 22 and for Jesus saying Psalm 22 from the cross.
Mm-hmm.
The other one, Dumbledore. For the first several books, Dumbledore was practically omnipotent and all-knowing because Harry was so young and was still learning about the wizarding world.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually even his expertise ran out. And then, of course, in Book 6, Dumbledore dies. Do we cast God in those roles? We were talking about Dumbledore being a parallel for God in the books, to an extent. Do we cast God in the role of eventually reaching the edge of God's expertise? When we don't hear God, when Jesus didn't hear God from the cross, is that a sign of God's flaws and shortcomings? Or is it a sign that we haven't seen the whole picture?
Interesting. I've always thought about Jesus saying, why have you forsaken me? Just as this, lament, obviously, but as this exasperation and pain and just giving voice to that, but not necessarily as that God was not there and present. It's, the Lutheran in me looking back on the crucifixion with a theology of the cross to say that, well, we know because God chose to come to us and to be with us in Jesus, even so far as to be crucified. So we know that God is particularly with us in our suffering and in our pain. And so then I'm like, well, God must have been with Jesus because Jesus was suffering and in
Because
pain.
Jesus is God.
And
Yes.
because Jesus is God. Yeah. So, interesting.
I mean, I don't want to say that Jesus wasn't truly lamenting, wasn't truly angry, and in a lot of pain, physical pain, also emotional pain.
Yeah, he definitely
When he said
was.
this, he was definitely asking, have I been forsaken? Despite the fact that he literally signed up for this and then recommitted like the night before all this happens. But in the moment, he was still wondering, has God left me? I think that's something that we can draw strength from in our own lives. Of course, we're going to have these moments of terror, of tragedy, of asking ourselves, does God remember me in the worst moments of our lives? But even though we have those moments of feeling forsaken, that doesn't mean that we are. And it doesn't mean that they come as a surprise. I don't really know how to put this. You love your grandparents, perhaps, I hope. But you also know that your grandparents are significantly older than you are, and probably they're going to pass away before you do. You grow up kind of knowing that eventually you're going to have to walk through the process of grieving your grandparents. We acknowledge from a surprisingly young age, and I think usually younger than our parents expect of us, that we are all mortal and eventually we will die and we will have to deal with that tragedy of others dying around us. So it's not like we don't see that coming. And Jesus certainly saw the cross coming. But that didn't mean that he wasn't capable of emotional extremes in the moment, and it doesn't mean that he didn't truly, I think he truly felt like he had been forsaken. Of course he did. I can't even imagine the pain of being crucified.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make any of his pain and suffering less real or less important or less valid, to use the term we've used today. But it also doesn't mean that the end of the psalm doesn't come. It doesn't mean that the trust in God doesn't eventually return once you come out the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the other things that popped into my mind while you were talking, Kate, was that I wonder how much the crowd and the people around him had to do with this, right? So we think about the church, and we talk about the church a lot of times as the body of Christ, right? We talk about it as a community of faith. And the ways that we encounter God are frequently through other people and with other people. And I think the cross, particularly for Jesus, was just such a lonely place where, yes, we'll get to the point where we hear that he connects his mother and the beloved disciple and all of those things, but he has just been betrayed by one of his closest friends. He has been abandoned by all of his friends, well, all of his male friends. He has been denied by one of his closest friends. And that is so hard, right? I think about Harry in book 4 when he becomes the Triwizard Champion, and he even gets abandoned by Ron. Or in book 7 when they're traveling and he's abandoned by Ron. Hermione sticks by him, right? Which is huge. I mean, the books would not exist without her. But that feeling of abandonment is so strong when it is those who are closest to you, those who we assume will always be with us and for us. And then to realize that they're not is huge. And then, so you take that and then you multiply it by all of the pain and the suffering of the cross itself. And it's no wonder, like, it's a surprise that Jesus didn't use Psalm 88, which doesn't have a happy ending.
And there is, of course, always the ongoing question of what would the Bible be like if we actually got every word they spoke, and how much of it has been Bowdlerized, which is I believe, the Shakespearean term for removing all of the ugly language.
Oh, okay.
One of the things I like to do with my confirmation students is show them a couple of parts where the language in the Bible is a lot stronger than it actually gets translated.
Mm-hmm.
What would the cross sound like if we actually heard everything everybody really said?
Mm.
Because when we read that passage, we also have to acknowledge that we're getting a certain version of that story. I mean, the Gospels tell us that. We have 4 Gospels because we have all these different points of view. And that's true for the Harry Potter books, too. We always have Harry's point of view, but never the full background about what this person really meant when they said that, or how this person's childhood affected, we have that for a couple people, but we don't have the full background on everybody, which is why fan fiction has taken up so much of the slack. And I don't want to say that we read fiction the same way that we read the Bible, because we don't. Harry Potter and the sacred text aside. There are some habits that we learn reading fiction that we can also take and apply to the Bible, and in a faithful way.
Yep.
Our next reading for Good Friday is Hebrews chapter 10, verses 16 through 25. Jesus' death brought about forgiveness of sin, which we remember each time we gather to worship, through the liturgy of confession and forgiveness, and through Holy Communion.
So part of this passage that really connected with me was the renewing and the new starts. And I think about each new year in the Harry Potter books kind of feels like a moment for restart where sins are forgiven, right? Ginny is not held responsible for the Chamber of Secrets in book 3. After book 5, it doesn't seem like anybody is held accountable for helping Umbridge. And those things are maybe forgiven, maybe forgotten, maybe people are attempting to forget. So it's not necessarily for the same reasons, and I think those sometimes come back to haunt the characters, especially those who helped Umbridge, and the role that Umbridge played comes back up, especially when Voldemort and his followers take over at Hogwarts. But it's this effort of, okay, we get to try and start over. We get to try to have a fresh start.
When we read the line in the book of Hebrews, hold fast to confession of hope without wavering, the person for me that comes to mind is Percy Weasley. I will always be fond of Percy. I understand that we're not really supposed to like him that much, but man, he reminds me of me. And so, of course, I'm going to. But one of the things that I always liked about him is that he was always so convinced that the answer for every problem could somehow be found in the ministry. The ministry could always help. The ministry could always be a force for good. And okay, yes, he was wrong about it, but man, I would love to have that kind of faith in a government, any government, not even just my government.
Oh, amen.
And for that reason, I love Percy, because Percy does have that absolute trust. And I think that's great, and I'd love to be able to borrow that for 5 minutes here and there. We also have the people being instructed to not neglect to meet together. And that makes me think of Dumbledore's army, because that was only ever partially about learning. Also, it was about mutual support and backing each other up, and it was a place where they could say, no, this isn't normal. Yes, it should be a different way. And other people could support them in that and remind them that it was true when they forgot, which is an important part of being able to stand up to any kind of oppression. When the book of Hebrews instructs us not to neglect to meet together, it's not just because we come to church to be nurtured ourselves by the worship service, by each other, etc., but also because we come to church to nurture others. Because church is about worshiping God, but church is also about helping each other and being together. Christianity is not an individual faith. It's not spirituality. It's religion. We do this together because that's what we've been called to do, because that's what it means to be Christian, to nurture each other and to show up not just because of what we need, but also because of how we can help what other people need.
And I think one of the places we do that really well is actually at funerals. Right? That everybody knows that, like, you're going to a funeral to support the ones who are most impacted by this person's death.
Because the funeral is almost never really about the person who died. It's almost always about the people who are mourning them.
Yep, the people they left behind. But I think if people approached church the way that they approach funerals, it would be very different, right? Because that person who is mourning their loved one at the funeral might be in church on Sunday.
And they're going to need you then, too.
Yep, they're probably still mourning that loved one, and they will be for years. And I think we also do this when times are really rough, right? So when we have vigils or when there's a crisis, the church has become a sort of default for that because because we are accustomed to meeting together, because we don't neglect to meet together. So it's not just, when everybody gathers at Dumbledore's funeral, right? But it's also before that when everybody gathers at the base of the astronomy tower and the light from their wands, at least in the movies, becomes a vigil.
In the same way that some of the biggest church attendance numbers America saw were in the second half of September and also in October of 2001. And that wasn't just people who had actually lost someone on 9/11. That was also people who just lived here and were stunned by what had happened, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to talk about it. They didn't know where to go, and so they came to church. I was not clergy at that point. I was actually a brand new college student. I was a freshman. I was 2 weeks into my first term. That afternoon, I went to Wartburg College, which has not only campus pastors, but also a chapel. And so there was a meeting that afternoon. I wouldn't exactly call it a service because they didn't have a lot of time to plan it. There wasn't a lot of liturgy, but it was a time for people to get together and talk about how they'd been affected. And there were a couple of brief talks about grief and what it looks like and how the next couple of days, please eat a little extra and sleep a little extra and treat yourself well because that's going to help you through this, that kind of thing. And of course we also prayed, and of course we also read the Bible. But what I remember about that afternoon and being at that service isn't the scripture we read. It isn't the prayers we said. It isn't the advice on grief that we got. It's being together. That place was packed, and the being together was what mattered in the end.
And I think the church has such an important role to play in that, like you were saying, when people don't know what to say or what to do or where to go or how to be, the church is historically a place to give us language and to give us voice to talk about what is happening in the world. And I think particularly for white mainline Protestant congregations, that's something we've drifted from. We tend to try to avoid talking about the difficult things, and so people have gone to other places to find language, and many people have gone to Harry Potter, for example, to find language to talk about what is going on in the world, because fiction can give us that language, especially young adult dystopias. But they give that language, and they give that idea, particularly to youth, right? That, no, we could change this. It doesn't have to be this way. It can be another way. And that's a role the church should play. And sometimes does play, and sometimes fails to play.
And I think a chunk of that is because when the big disaster happens, the church is there to help. But we also need to do the work of just the everyday stuff. It's because when we wrestle with these questions of how do we deal with evil, how do we deal with grief, it's not always going to be the big noticeable stuff like 9/11 or like the tragic funeral in town that week or that kind of thing. It's also dealing with the smaller but still just as painful everyday stuff. And for that, we meet at least every week because that's how much we need each other. And if you don't particularly need other people that week, other people might need you.
So now we begin John, chapters 18 and 19, which is the story of Christ's trial, crucifixion, and death, which is commonly called the Passion. So John has the most detailed account, which is 2 chapters long, and we've broken it up into smaller pieces to discuss. A lot of people also use these breaks in like a tenebrae service of darkness or some other Good Friday worship services too. In John 18, verses 1 through 11, Jesus and his disciples are confronted by soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane. I keep thinking of the Battle of Hogwarts for this, right? At first I was thinking about Voldemort going out with his disciples and Death Eaters and Harry coming to him, but that feels weird to compare Voldemort and Jesus.
I am on board with not making that particular comparison.
Yep. But I also then thought about Harry going into the Forbidden Forest and presenting himself to Voldemort unarmed, and that willingness and knowledge that this was going to happen, and
being willing to sacrifice himself.
Yeah.
I mean, Harry was getting compared to Jesus by fans of the books before this, but that was what really cemented it for most people.
Yeah.
The story in the books that this reminds me of is Bill's wedding. It's one last opportunity for rest and peace. Then, instead of getting that rest and peace that was so needed before everything really starts, they are saying, thank goodness for Hermione's handbag, because now, look, everything's happening, and we have to get started before we wanted to. We sometimes find that this happens in real life. We thought we had a chance to really enjoy a day, and then instead, Great Aunt Hortense has a heart attack or something, and you're shoved into parts of your life you really didn't want to be there that day. A wedding day being like that must have been hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I also think that Ron and Simon Peter are very similar in this passage, but also a little bit throughout both the Bible and this series. Both of them are a little bit rash, driven by impulse and emotion. Peter draws his sword and cuts off Malchus's ear, and Ron draws his broken wand and tries to make Malfoy eat slugs. In both cases, those are not actually helpful activities, but their heart is kind of in the right place.
Simon Peter also kind of reminds me of Sirius Black, because he is always the king of let's do this rash and dangerous thing because obviously that's the right answer. I don't know if from the Bible we can tell whether or not Simon Peter has the PTSD to explain it. So I guess that means that Sirius and Ron have some things in common as well. They do play surprisingly similar roles in Harry's life, come to think of it.
Yeah, and they both, right? They're both best friends of a Potter boy.
Sure.
Interesting.
I also look at the line in this passage of, I did not lose a single one of those who you gave me.
Mm.
Jesus didn't lose any of his disciples, but Harry lost some of his friends.
Mm-hmm. A lot.
And I think that reminds us of the dangers of deifying our real-life heroes, of trying to turn them into something to be worshipped. Because Harry does his best, but he's not actually Jesus. He's not God. He's not perfect. He does make mistakes.
Yeah, and that's reminds me of something we talked about in our last episode, that part of it is recognizing the humanness, and if we deify heroes, it gives us the out, right? We don't have to do it because that person was too godly and too perfect, and so we could never be that person, when in reality, they were a human being. They had their flaws.
Right.
And we have our flaws, and we can make a difference.
Sure. So for the next piece of the Passion story, we're taking on John chapter 18, verses 12 through 27. In this passage, Jesus is taken before the high priest Caiaphas, and Simon Peter denies knowing Jesus in the courtyard outside 3 times, as Jesus predicted.
So the connection for me is Jesus says, well, when they ask Jesus questions about what he's done and who he is, and Jesus says, well, ask them what I said. Ask other people what I said, what I did. And throughout the books, the ways that people know who Harry or Ron or Hermione are is based on what has been said about them. Their eye color, the scar, defeating the Dark Lord, red hair, large family without much money, know-it-all, brilliant, bushy hair. Each of those different things are things that are said about them. And I think there are 2 different ways, right? One is, I think according to Jewish law, you can't perjure yourself. So they have to bring witnesses in order to convict Jesus. And Jesus is calling them on that they're not doing that because they can't find anybody. But also I think it's just kind of one of those, he's in this super messed up situation and has a bunch of terrible options, and this is the best of bad options. The other thing that came up in this passage for me was respectability politics. Jesus isn't cooperating with this interrogation trial sham of a thing, and so the police hit him. And I mean, I can look back on our history in this country of the number of times when people say, you just have to be nicer, don't talk back, you'll be fine. And
that's not true.
It's not true, and it's not how it's supposed to work. And so it made me think in book 3, at the end of book 3, when Sirius escapes and Snape completely flips out because he can't handle the disappointment and the reality of Sirius escaping from right under his nose, because he's harbored such a huge grudge for so long.
Or, in the interest of grabbing hilarity where we can find it in these dark conversations, I also think of Dumbledore in the 4th movie, jumping into the room with the champions and screaming at Harry and grabbing him by the collar and practically throwing him around about, "Did you put your name in?" And I don't remember the exact line, but man, that was way over the top. Mm-hmm. And clearly the new actor for Dumbledore introducing himself in a way. This idea of respectability politics, we see that throughout the Harry Potter books in so many different ways. Harry has to behave a certain way in order to be listened to. Hermione, gracious, has to behave a certain way in order to be listened to. And sometimes she's able to use that to her own ends, because sometimes being the bookworm and the responsible one means you get away with all kinds of stuff. Not that I personally would know anything about that.
No, none of us have stolen potions ingredients from Snape's office.
No, and especially now that I happen to know that my mother is listening to this podcast, you should not be worried at all, Mom. Love you. But when it comes to that, and to the Bible, I also think about our earlier conversation about women in the Bible, and how, I think this was last episode, how so many of them don't have names. Mm-hmm. And so many of them don't get to talk themselves. We don't hear their words. I think about that, and I think about how in real life, women have to behave in certain ways, or feminine-appearing people have to behave in certain ways in order to not only be respected, like Hermione in the books, but even to be safe. Mm-hmm. I've had conversations with men about the way that women have to behave in order to not get killed. Yeah. And the number of times that men have been offended by this. Because, well, I wouldn't do that. Why are you assuming all men would? I'm not assuming all men would. I'm assuming that approximately 1% of all men would, but they're not exactly wearing facial tattoos that tell me that that's who they are, you know?
That would be handy.
Even with people I've known, even with people I've been friends with for years, somewhere in the back of my head is that tiny little survival instinct shouting, you have to be careful. Mm-hmm. And when we see women talk to Jesus in the Bible, you notice almost always they're in a public place. I mean, even the woman at the well, they're alone, but anybody could walk up to them. You never know. And part of the reason isn't just that it was respectable for them to, I mean, they weren't really supposed to talk to men they weren't related to anyway, but it wasn't just that they did it publicly because that was the least unrespectable way to do it, but also because if there were other people there, they were safer.
Mm-hmm. So it's one thing when it's like those folks like yourself who identify as cisgender women, right? And then add into that transgender women and femmes, especially transgender women of color, have such a higher chance of being killed, right? The statistics are horrible.
Terrifying.
And it is this. It's respectability politics. It's assumptions. It's who is allowed to belong in a space and who is not. I mean, I think about Umbridge, right? And when Professor Umbridge becomes the High Inquisitor and starts putting out all of these decrees, and the movies kind of paint the picture even more drastically, to the extent that, like, Umbridge is totally unaware of queer people, so that it's just boys and girls have to be separated,
and all the lesbians rejoiced.
Yes.
Yes.
But she has such an emphasis on who is allowed to be in a place and who is not allowed to be in the place. And so this comes out when she is sitting in on classes and evaluating the teachers in the classes, right? When it's Hagrid, she is ridiculous, and the way that she acts actually undermines, it's gaslighting, right? It undermines how he teaches and his ability to teach what actually is a really great lesson. But, I mean, in the movies, she's measuring Flitwick.
Right. And that has no place in how he does his job.
Yep. And so those sorts of different things where she has this idea of what is proper and appropriate, and wizardy, and anything else.
And what children should be exposed to.
Yep, and anything else is just not okay.
Right.
To the extent that she causes physical harm because of it.
Right. I think we can also draw a parallel between the people we see in this scene in the scripture passage and also the people we see in the Harry Potter books. We have in this scene in the scripture passage, you have the Roman soldiers, you have the Jewish police, you have the disciples and the Jewish people, and they all are playing different roles in the story. They play different roles in the community. The Jewish police are people who are essentially collaborating with the Roman occupying force. I think in a way we could compare them to the prefects in Book 7 who are cooperating with the Death Eaters who are running the school.
And in Book 5, who cooperate with Umbridge. They're called something else. What are they called?
But the police wouldn't have a ton of power in that situation, but they had power over their own people, and that's what they were going for.
Then I was thinking about if the teachers would be the Roman soldiers in this situation, because all of the teachers
are cooperating to a level that not even the students are.
Yeah, and they have more power, right? And yet not all of them are, they're both corroborating and not, right? So
right.
they all have some power and some responsibility for the way the school is run.
And several of them are clearly staying there just to mitigate the amount of evil that happens.
Right, and so that's the tricky part is there are soldiers who support Jesus or who interact positively with Jesus and are not as explicitly supporting the oppressive regime, but they still hold it up.
They're part of the system.
They're still part of the system.
Yeah.
And so then the teachers at Hogwarts are still part of the system that has become so corrupt, even though they're holding it up ostensibly to support and protect the students.
Right.
And that, I think that's something that we all kind of have to wrestle with, right? Is how much is our role in the church, in our country, in our communities, how much is the role that we play, the role that we have, supporting something that is corrupt or oppressive, and how much is it protecting those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, and how do we navigate that gray area? Yeah, something to continue thinking about.
That is another one of those conversations. We're never going to cover all of it in one podcast episode.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think that in this section of the Passion story, we can definitely compare Simon Peter and Peter Pettigrew. Peter certainly, both Peters denied their friends. One of them in a different way, not publicly. Instead, he just turned into a rat for several years. That comparison, I think, is pretty obvious.
Yeah, and I think Malfoy could be Simon Peter in this situation, because Malfoy in Book 7, after the trio are caught by the Snatchers, Hermione blasts Harry with a stinging curse, and so he's fairly unrecognizable, but probably recognizable to Malfoy, who has spent, 6 years obsessing about him. But when Malfoy's family asks him to identify Harry for sure so that they know, so they don't call Voldemort for a false alarm, he says he doesn't know if it's Harry. Mm-hmm. And so he denies Harry, but in a positive way, right?
Right.
He denies his family.
He's betraying evil, actually, in that.
Yeah.
So it's not a perfect parallel, but it's interesting. I like it.
Our next section of John is John chapter 18, verses 28 to 40. So Jesus is taken to Pilate, who does not want to execute him, and they discuss whether he is the king of the Jews. So in Book 5, when Harry is tried for casting a Patronus, the beginning of the book when he saves himself and Dudley from the Dementors, the whole group who is in that trial is ready to expel or condemn him. That is how Fudge has set this up. But unlike Jesus, Harry has at least one person advocating for him. 2 if you count Miss Fig for being a witness in his defense. And that is enough to save him. It's enough to make clear the doubt about this. It's enough to name the reality that Harry's life was at risk, and Dudley's was as well. But Jesus doesn't have anybody, and even Peter just denied him. It also made me think of Umbridge's trials of Muggleborns in Book 7, the whole charade that is set up to condemn them, even though, by Rowling's account, they all have a magical ancestor somewhere along the line, which is an interesting complication that I don't really like. But Umbridge's trials are set up to condemn Muggleborns. The Dementors are there to terrorize them, and the Patronuses protect Umbridge and the others who are trying them, but not the actual people themselves. Okay, let's be real. The entire Ministry of Magic judicial system is, like, completely corrupt. Buckbeak has a total sham of a trial in Book 3. Sirius doesn't get a trial. Crouch Jr.'s trial is just a show of how much his dad now has decided to hate him. The whole trial is just a sham.
I'm also trying to come up with how to explain this, but Umbridge is an interesting case in that she wouldn't call herself a Death Eater by any means, I think, at any point in the series. That's not what she'd think of herself as. But we see her on this journey from Book 5 to Book 7, where her own preconceptions, her own beliefs get co-opted. I mean, in Book 5, she's a certain level of horrible, yes. But in Book 7, when she starts doing these trials, that's a whole new level of cooperating with evil that we had not seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in real life, and also in the Bible, we could think of people who, they didn't really sign up to do evil, but their own bigotry, their own beliefs about how the world should work, their own sometimes selfish desires, led them to it. They weren't saying to themselves, twirling their mustache, how evil can I be today? But instead, they landed there because they wanted to reinforce their own understanding of how the world should work. And in some ways, I think that is a parallel to Pilate in the Bible, because Pilate's an interesting character because he never wants to kill Jesus himself, and yet he allows it to happen. And he's the example in the Bible of, if one person had stood up and said, no, we're not doing this, Jesus would not have been crucified.
Mm-hmm.
And that person is Pilate, and he didn't do it. He wanted to, but he allowed himself to be swayed otherwise. And I think there are a lot of problems with paralleling Umbridge to Pilate in other ways, but I think in that way, there's a difference between the kind of evil people that we like to talk about because they're so easy to characterize and so easy to pretend to ourselves that we'll never be like them. And then there's people like Umbridge and Pilate, where they weren't mustache twirling, they were just trying to do what they thought was the correct thing. Not necessarily even the right thing, just the correct thing. He's trying. He wants to understand. He wants to get it. And that's part of what makes him such a compelling character. He's trying to do some amount of good work in a admittedly corrupt system. And we have plenty of examples in Harry Potter for that. We have Percy, we have Fudge, we have even Dumbledore to an extent, even Arthur Weasley. They're all trying to do some good while in a corrupt system, and yet the corrupt system sometimes, for most of them, winds up leading them to places that they didn't want to go.
Yeah, that's also how I tend to interpret Pilate too, right? Like, it just sucks to be Pilate because he doesn't want to, but he doesn't feel like he has a choice. Joan of Arcadia is a TV show that I like that was only on for 2 seasons because it was too scandalous, but where God talks about Joan had a failure of imagination. And I think that's particularly for Pilate what's going on. He can't imagine a way this could end with Jesus alive and not having a riot.
He can't imagine a way for the system not to be corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Also in this passage we have this implied question of which law applies in which situation. And when it comes to the Harry Potter books, Arthur Weasley, we don't explore what he actually does for a living nearly enough. I would love to have a day at the office with Arthur. Because the misuse of Muggle artifacts office we get a certain sense of the general chaos there. But there's also the question of which law applies where. At what point do they contact the Muggle police? And if so, how do they explain this? How much crossover is there between what they do and what the police do? How much crossover do they have with the Aurora's office? That kind of thing.
I've always just assumed that they try to avoid any interactions with the police at all, if at all possible. And so then the only overlap would be at the Prime Minister level. I think wizards just have no respect for Muggle laws, really.
Or for Muggles at all.
Right, except to the extent that it would reveal their secret.
Right. That also brings to mind that it is a corrupt system, because what kind of injustices are they allowing to go unchecked in that case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the truth is always hidden.
Right. And if you come to testify to the truth, just like Jesus, just like Harry, just like so many other characters, that can totally get you killed in the wrong circumstances.
For sure.
Our next passage, John 19, verses 1 through 7. Pilate has Jesus flogged to appease the crowd, but when they still demand his death, he washes his hands of the affair and allows them to crucify Jesus.
So this is brought up for me in Book 5 when Fudge is completely paranoid about Dumbledore. He actually goes so far off into his paranoia that he circles back around to the truth, or at least the future truth, of Dumbledore's army. So similar to the parody of Jesus as King of the Jews, goes so far off the edge that it circles back around to the deeper truth. Fudge is so far off that he's actually like naming a truth
about Dumbledore's army, even.
Yeah, which is just fascinating to me, that like the number of times when we do that, where we accidentally can name the truth when we're trying to be derisive about it, or
how much of evil is good being twisted. All the way around to the other side. We've been using the word crucify a lot, and when we talk about the word crucify, for those of us who are Harry Potter fans, it reminds us of the word crucio, doesn't it? Which is one of the unforgivable curses, the Cruciatus curse, which causes unspeakable pain, which actually makes me wonder if in the Harry Potter universe, did Jesus have the Cruciatus curse used on him rather than being crucified? There's a question.
Ooh.
But the relationship between those two words isn't accidental. J.K. Rowling didn't just happen to pick that word because it sounded good. It sounded good because there is this parallel here. We'll talk about it a bit more later, but if you've ever wondered exactly how does crucifixion kill you, we will be linking to an article that will explain that in our show notes on our blog.
Suffice it to say, the Cruciatus curse would be, except for the fact that it doesn't actually ever kill you, the Cruciatus curse would be a really good parallel.
And one of the interesting things that fandom imagined about the Cruciatus curse, I don't know that it applies to the Bible part in particular, but there is at least one fanfiction story where there is a counterspell to the Cruciatus curse, but it's approximately 17 syllables long, and if you just had it cast on you, there is no way you're going to be able to say it out loud.
Right, because the pain is too much.
Right.
I mean, you can't really talk on the cross. Like, you couldn't say 17 syllables because you have to, like, stand
Jesus
up
only said 7 words, and that was over the course of several hours. Yeah. When it comes to demanding an unfair death, which is basically what the crowd is doing and what Pilate winds up doing himself, because when he washes his hands, he allows that to happen. My mind went back to the 4th book, and I'm not talking about Cedric's death, I'm talking about Harry. I wonder how the book would have gone if Harry had sat out the Triwizard Tournament out of good sportsmanship. I realized that of course he wasn't going to, because otherwise we wouldn't get to see the inside of what all the tasks look like. It's a storytelling device. But if he had said, I didn't put in my own name, I don't deserve to compete against these truly worthy opponents, so I'll just sit on the sidelines and let them win. I mean, even if he had gone to every event and just sat there and let the other guys do their thing, that would have been a very interesting story, and also handily would have foiled Barty Crouch. And at the end of the story, we do realize that Barty was demanding an unfair death by insisting that Harry compete. He was expecting Harry to be the one to die.
That actually came up in a recent episode of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and so we'll link to that episode. But yeah, what would it have looked like to not be seeking that glory, but to say, no, Cedric Diggory is the true champion. He's the one that we should all be supporting.
And so when we ask ourselves, what if Pilate hadn't gone along and allowed Jesus to die? I mean, the stakes are actually very similar, even though Harry doesn't know it at the time. That's a good question for us to ask ourselves about both books.
Our next section is John chapter 19, verses 8 to 16a, so the first half of verse 16. Pilate questions Jesus, looking for a way to release him, but ultimately hands him over to be crucified. After Pilate and Jesus are going back and forth in verse 12 it says, "From then on Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Judeans cried out, 'If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor.'" That reminded me of Fudge and Scrimger. So both ministers of magic both put pressure on Harry to be friends of the ministry, or in their case, the emperor, at the end of book 6 and the beginning of book 7, so that he would help them look good for others. So similarly to how this community and these religious authorities are trying to pressure Pilate to be friends of the emperor and put that pressure on him to crucify Jesus, Harry has a lot of pressure to seem like he's supporting the ministry, even while Harry's clear about not doing that because he doesn't trust the ministry, because the ministry is not actually doing the work that needs to happen, but instead is trying to look good.
Right. And when we think about the one who handed me over, there's a few different people that fit that characterization for Jesus. Judas handed him over, yes, but also Herod did. Herod passed him on to Pilate. Pilate passed him on to the crowd's desire. If we're looking at least for Judas and Herod for parallels in the Harry Potter books, for Judas, I think the obvious parallel is Peter Pettigrew, who betrayed his friends. And for Herod, I think Umbridge works as a Herod character. She did not have the full level of power that the ministry had, just as Herod did not have the full level of power that Pilate had. But she was supposed to be one of their own. Herod cooperated with the Romans, just as Umbridge would eventually cooperate with the Death Eaters. Which brings up the question of which is the greater sin, which is the greater betrayal, a personal betrayal, or betraying the system for your own benefit, which is what both Herod and Umbridge did. They betrayed a system to become more powerful themselves.
Yeah, and that reminded me of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which calls out the white moderates, right? The silence of friends is worse than the explicit hate of the extremists, in that case, the white supremacists. That it is when you just go along to get along, when you don't challenge the things that are corrupt, or when you don't hold true to the greater ideals, that you actually can cause more harm than people who just outright say terrible things and do terrible things.
Right. Which brings us back to Pilate again, who is totally of the mind saying, well, I would help you. I would love to help you. It would be great if I could help you, but if I do, I'll get dead. So no, I'm not going to help you. When we make that comparison, who does come to mind? I'm not really sure that Pettigrew fits this because we're never really told everything about what Pettigrew's motivations are. I mean, there's definitely a sense of, in book 4, the reason why he cuts his own hand off is because Voldemort will kill him otherwise. But why he betrayed his friends in the beginning, I don't think we ever get a solid answer on why he did that. And there's a few different theories about it. One is just that he was afraid and he wanted to be safe. Another is that his friends, the other marauders, were not actually that nice to him, and maybe he did want to get some of his own back. If we don't know what his motivations are, we can't really make that parallel, but you had a good idea.
And I think Pettigrew was the first one that came to my mind, too, especially in book 3, when he's going from Harry to Ron to Hermione, trying to get them to save his life, which ends up working, and he gets away and all that terrible things. But Xenophilius Lovegood, I think, is this character. So he, in the Quibbler, in book 5, once he publishes Harry's article telling the story of what happened at the end of book 4, the Quibbler starts to actually have a reputation, especially in book 7, that the prophet is so heavily pressured by the Ministry of Magic, no matter who's in charge, that it's not a reliable source of information and news. And so Xenophilius Lovegood's magazine, The Quibbler, which has never been considered a reliable source of news by the majority of the Wizarding community, starts to actually be the one publication that is telling the truth. And yet, when Harry and Hermione and Ron show up on his doorstep looking for help and looking for the story of the Deathly Hallows and the Three Brothers, Xenophilius says, I can't help you, and it has just started to print, actually, a copy of the Quibbler that condemns Harry. And for him, it's not so much his own being kept alive, but the Death Eaters have captured Luna, and he will do anything to save her. And Harry actually has a great and really mature response to this, to recognize, yeah, it sucks that he sold them out, but he was doing it because he loved his daughter and would do anything for his daughter.
Of course, then there's also the point that we're pretty sure that even if he had done everything they'd asked, they'd eventually kill Luna anyway. But there is no good answer in some of these situations. Our next passage is John chapter 19, the second half of verse 16 through verse 22, which is a bit longer than it sounds like, if I remember right. Jesus is crucified, and Pilate writes the inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, above him on the cross.
Jesus carries the cross by himself. They make a point of saying, and carrying the cross by himself.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about the trio when they're carrying the locket, or even Ginny carrying the diary. The locket would have killed them, and the diary almost killed Ginny. And to think about Horcruxes as instruments of death in a similar way to crosses. And so that's just an interesting way, I think, to think about the instruments of death that we have and that are carried around. And it's particularly difficult right now to read through the Passion with all of the violence that's being enacted throughout this country in particular, but also the world and the threats of violence that we are facing, and to not wonder about the different instruments of death that we have and that we glorify sometimes too.
We can't kid ourselves that carrying around an instrument of death, whether it's a locket, whether it's a diary, whether it's the One Ring in Lord of the Rings, or anything in real life, we can't kid ourselves that carrying those doesn't affect us.
Mm-hmm.
They do have an effect on us. They had an effect on Ginny. They had an effect on the trio. They had an effect on Frodo and Sam and the rest of the Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
When we bring ourselves that close to something that brings about death, we can allow ourselves to get comfortable, which is one of the interesting conversations I've had about gun safety. One of the most important lessons in any gun safety class is that you can never truly be comfortable with a gun, with a weapon, because it can, at any time, malfunction in some way that could hurt you or someone else. And it's when you get comfortable, it's when you feel comfortable with it, that's when you're in the most danger. It's a lesson that tragically is not as well learned by some and has tragic consequences. It is a lesson that experienced gun owners find themselves falling afoul of without realizing it. I think that's true in other ways in our lives, not just about gun safety, but I've known people who have said, oh, I want to study this group, this type of people, because I want to understand where they're coming from. I want to understand them so that I can fight against them, whether it's white supremacists or serial killers, or some might be familiar with the story of Mandy Patinkin and why he quit the show Criminal Minds, because he didn't know that there was going to be that much murder and that much focus on the mind of murderers in the show, and he just couldn't handle it. And we say to ourselves, we want to study these people so that we can figure out how to make sure that no more people are like them, and also make sure that we can make sure that they don't hurt people. But there is also that inherent danger of becoming like them as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think about the idea of carrying a gun or an instrument of death around and just how jumpy I would be. And we see this with the Horcrux, right? Whether it's the locket or the diary, whoever's carrying it is way jumpier, way testier. And that's dangerous, right? If you're carrying an instrument of death around and you're jumpy, I can't imagine doing it.
Or the other side effect that sometimes happens is that you feel like you're king or queen of the world and nothing can touch you. And that has its own dangers as well.
Right? Like with the Elder Wand in the story of the Three Brothers.
Right.
Yeah, it's instruments of death.
I do love that both the Bible and the Harry Potter books have in common that sometimes the names are just perfect. In the Bible, we have the Place of the Skull, which of course, if you have a place in town that's called, or just outside of town, that's called the Place of the Skull, of course that's where you'd commit executions. Totally. That makes sense. You're not going to have Lover's Lane up there. No, that's where you're going to go to kill people.
Oh my gosh, that'd be a terrible Lover's Lane.
Signs that you really need to leave town. Lover's Lane is called the Place of the Skull. But also in Harry Potter, of course, we have oodles of on-the-nose names. My personal favorite example being Remus Lupin, whose unofficial fandom name is Werewolf McWerewolf.
Werewolf McWerewolf.
Sometimes I honestly call him that without thinking to this day. Thank you, fandom.
Oh, no.
The ways you've affected me.
And I've seen that in other places, too, where I'm like, right. Oh, yep. Mm-hmm. In the Harry Potter Alliance, they have they're doing a campaign right now to encourage people to write to their representatives about funding for libraries, because that's being cut again. The way they write it is, "Dear Senator McSenator Face, from constituent McConstituent Face." And so that just made me think of that. And I wonder if that's where they got it from.
I'm sure it's a similar meme.
Mm-hmm.
That memes do keep changing. I do notice Pilate still has his one tiny rebellion in this section, his last rebellion against what's happening. He's not going to stop it, but when he's writing on the note on the cross, he will call Jesus the King of the Jews instead of saying this man called himself the King of the Jews. And it reminds me of the students who are at Hogwarts in Book 7. They're part of the system, they're participating in the system by going to Hogwarts instead of staying home or being part of the rebellion. But they do still have their own rebellions. And of course they have their own reasons for not participating. But they do still have their own rebellions against what is there. And those rebellions matter. Neville winds up killing Nagini because of everything that he learned in Dumbledore's army, and also because he has the strength himself to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And those little pieces of rebellion, even if you can't participate in the big shiny version, the little stuff that you do can make a noticeable difference in the lives of others. And I love that Bible bothers teaching that lesson. I love that the Harry Potter books bother teaching that lesson too.
Yes, it's like the writing on the memorial at Godric's Hollow, right? When Harry goes up to see the house that he grew up in for his first year-ish of life. And the little stand with the sign comes up and it says what it is, but then all around it people have written messages of support and love and encouragement for Harry.
The three languages that Pilate writes in are Hebrew, which was the local vernacular at the time, Latin, which was the language of the formerly educated and would have been Pilate's own language, being that he worked for the Romans, and Greek, which was kind of the lingua franca, the business language, the language you spoke to do cross-country business with. We don't get a lot of the code switching that happens in the Bible because it's all translated into English and it's kind of hard to tell the difference. But in the Harry Potter books, we see a lot of code switching. Hermione in particular is very good at it. She speaks differently with teachers than she does with her friends, than she does when she's talking about her parents, and so on. And that is a necessary skill, and one that teenagers do tend to be very good at.
Yes, and I think particularly because I think one of the things that Hermione brings to that is that she is an outsider.
In so many ways.
Right, as a Muggle-born, potentially as Black.
As a nerd,
that she has to figure out how to speak in the dominant language. And that automatically lends itself to the code switching. But I do think we get it somewhat in the Bible in Jesus. I think Jesus is really good at code switching.
Sure.
Because he'll tell parables and he'll tell stories to people in a certain way. He'll talk to the religious authorities and the people who are upset with him in another way. So he kind of challenges and pushes things in certain ways with other people and provides comfort or encouragement or strength for others.
Or even something as basic as when he's talking to the masses, he will remind them of biblical stories. But when he's talking to educated religious authorities, he will quote specific verses.
Our next passage is John chapter 19, verses 23 through 30. So in this passage, the soldiers divide Jesus' clothing, and Jesus connects his mother and the beloved disciple, and then dies. So Jesus, when he's going to die, says, "It is finished." And Harry also has a moment where he has to realize that he's going to die, and he tells the snitch that he's going to die. And this is where it gets hard to not make Harry the Jesus stand-in, right? Because there are so many similarities in our hero arc, but that naming of the end and that facing death head on was big. And the way they kind of diverge there, though, is Jesus is in many ways giving up his familial connections, right? He's connecting his mother to this disciple whom he loves and putting them in a mother-child relationship.
And if I remember correctly, we see Jesus reunited with his disciples. We see him reunited with Mary Magdalene. We never see his reunion with his mother.
That's true. So Jesus really is, it's not just a right now thing, but Jesus really is giving up those familial connections. Harry actually does the opposite, right? So in telling the snitch he's going to die, he gets the resurrection stone, and when he flips it 3 times, his family appears. His mom and his dad and his godfather and Remus all appear and surround him and support him. And then when he does die, when Voldemort casts the killing curse on him, Harry has the opportunity to just be done and just go back and be with his family if he chooses to go on, as Dumbledore puts it. And Harry says no. They both end up not joining their families in some ways, but Harry has the opportunity for it and decides not to, decides to go back and live and fight another day.
And Hermione also gave up her parents, quite literally. We don't see them come back either, come to think of it. But she sent them away so that they could be safe. You know, I do kind of wonder if that was part of what Jesus was doing, giving his mother to the beloved disciple. She, as the mother of someone who had been crucified, might have been in danger. And by making sure that she still had a family connection, by making sure that someone who was there would look after her, he could have been trying to keep her safe.
Yeah.
And when I think about Jesus' death and what Jesus' death would have been like, and then I compare that to the various people who died in the Harry Potter books, the most obvious parallel for that in terms of a long, miserable, painful death that had absolutely no glory to it whatsoever is Regulus, who died alone, whose death was long and painful, and no one found out about it until after his only other living relative had died. Sirius was already dead. Sirius never got to find out about what Regulus did. That's one of the characteristics of the crucifixion, that there is no glory to it. There is no, I mean, there's a higher meaning, but you don't see that in the death itself. That doesn't come around until later. In the moment, it's just ugly and painful and miserable, and that's it. It's because the crucifixion is that way, isn't glossed over, that we know that God is truly with us even in the worst moments of our lives. And in the same way, we also know that there are people who are willing to go through terrible things so that others don't have to, just like Regulus was. And it's not always the people you expect.
Right. Yep. The student who stood in front of a door and got shot 5 times in Parkland.
Ron also fits as a parallel of the disciple Jesus loved with the second task for the tournament where he was the one that Harry had to save. And I love that it was him and not Hermione, it was him and not Ginny, it was him and not Cho Chang. For Harry, the important part has never been about romantic love. He was busy trying not to die for most of the books. For him, the surprising love, the love that sustained him and the love that he never really expected to get to have, was always friendship and family and chosen family. That is an important lesson for, I think, especially for young adult literature to give, because so often in American literature especially, but I think other literature too, and certainly also British literature, hi J.K. Rowling, we hold up romantic love as the pure, perfect version of love, and that's totally not true.
And super problematic.
Right, and just throws asexual and aromantic people right out the window like they don't exist. Which, you know, okay, society's been doing that for a long time, but let's not continue it, shall we?
Yeah, and I think the disciple that Jesus loved is really great for this conversation, and a conversation about love and attraction, and right, that we say the only valid kind of love is this romantic and sexual attraction to this person of a different gender, is usually how we, like, that's the message we get from culture. That's the message we get from, like, every romantic comedy, I think, in the history of ever, that is what you're looking for, and that it will be perfect. It will be everything that you need or want. And that's not at all reasonable. There are so many different types of love and types of attraction, right? That you can be romantically attracted to people and not sexually attracted to them, or vice versa. I like the idea of Ron as the disciple Jesus loved in the second task, if Harry is Jesus. And if any of the champions had been compared to Jesus, right? We could compare Krum or Cedric or Fleur to Jesus. And any of the people, right? Fleur's sister or Cho or Hermione could all be the disciple Jesus loved. We don't know who the disciple Jesus loved is. Some people say that it is a romantic or sexual attraction, that it is Mary Magdalene. I love the idea that it's Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, and Simon Peter is like the younger tag-along brother who wants to hang out with his older brother and his older brother's boyfriend, and then...
Right. Whereas I was brought up with the idea that the beloved disciple was totally John, who, I mean, the idea that I was taught as a child was that the disciple John wrote the Gospel of John, and therefore John was referring to himself, but not naming himself because he wanted to make it clear that, yes, Jesus totally loved me, but not naming himself because that would be, putting himself above himself.
I will tell you, my favorite part of this, Andrew as the beloved disciple thing, for the fish breakfast on the beach. Jesus shows up, the disciples are out fishing because they've already given up on anything else, and they realize that Jesus is on the beach. So what happens? Simon Peter is like, ooh, my buddy Jesus, he's back! Gets his clothes on, jumps in, swims right to shore. The beloved disciple is like, you have been dead for 3 days. And now you show up on the beach with some fish, and you want everything to just be fine? Well, you're going to have to wait till the boat comes to shore. I'm not rushing out into the water for you.
I do love that. I also kind of wonder if that was similar to the reunion with his mother that we never see. Because if I was Jesus' mom and Jesus had just pulled all this stuff, I would be a little pissed off that he put me through all this. And, of course, his mom was supposed to be with the beloved disciple, so maybe they were both kind of on that same boat.
Yeah, but I do think that it's helpful to have Ron as the one that Harry loves, because it does give us a larger picture of what love can and so frequently does mean for all of us.
Sure. Well, and for a lot of people who would not necessarily use these words to describe it, but I've met a lot of people who assume that Jesus did not experience sexual attraction, and while they might not call him asexual and use that word, that is essentially what they're describing. I've also met people who would assume that going along with that Jesus would not have experienced romantic attraction, and therefore he'd be aromantic as well.
Which is like a little bit questionable because you got the Samaritan woman at the well.
Well, yeah, he has a couple moments, but also how many asexual and aromantic people have blended themselves a bit. As a demisexual person, which growing up in the church and later becoming clergy was particularly weird because I thought I was normal because this was how love was always described in church. The idea that, of course, you don't want to have sex with someone you don't already have a deep emotional connection to. That's just how the world works. Wait, you're saying other people actually... Oh, I was confused for a very long time until I actually learned what the name of it was and that other people were like me too. First, I had to figure out that not everyone was like that, and that was pretty weird. But it's such a powerful thing for people to use the words, to call Jesus aromantic or asexual, or I suppose you could say demisexual if you wanted, depending on how you interpret certain scenes. To be able to identify with Jesus in that way, particularly when the church has not really been great about welcoming people like that.
Oh my gosh, the church is like the origin of not welcoming people like that, right? Like,
sure.
Homophobia,
well, some of it, to be honest, we can probably trace to Martin Luther and his enthusiasm about holding up marriage as the one perfect Christian way to live. And because the Catholic Church had a place, quite literally, for religious people who didn't want to deal with that part of life in religious orders. And Martin Luther just kind of threw all those out. But yeah, the church has done a lot of wrong by those people, and I love the idea that we can reclaim our place by identifying directly with Jesus. What gets more powerful than that? Our next passage is John 19, verses 31 through 42. Soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus prepare his body and place it in an unused tomb.
That got me thinking about how we bury people. So Jesus gets myrrh and aloes, and then Dumbledore gets this beautiful marble tomb. Dobby gets a roughly carved rock. The grave in Godric's Hollow for Harry's parents and his dad's family. The side chamber for Voldemort, right? At the end of the battle, he and Bellatrix are just placed in the side chamber. I think the same side chamber that they used for the champions in book 4.
Possibly, yeah.
But how do we honor, or in Voldemort and Bellatrix's case, not honor the dead? Part of me is like, Dobby should have a marble tomb. But
would you want one?
Right, and it wouldn't necessarily feel fitting, but...
Well, and having been in the clergy, I've been in cemeteries where I've said to myself, this person deserves a nicer headstone than this because they were a fantastic person. And I've also been in cemeteries where I looked at I realize that people's tastes differ, but there is such a thing as just completely throwing good taste out the window. And I've seen a few funeral monuments in cemeteries that are just horrifying. And maybe not everybody agrees with me, and that's okay, but they were horrifying to me. And I said, I don't know whether or not this person deserves that kind of thing, but I hope not, because they've been dead for several hundred years, so it's not like I could tell anyway. The way that we remember people and the way that they should be remembered are certainly not always the same thing. And again, for me, I've read enough fan fiction over the years that the thought that comes to mind for me is not from one of the actual Harry Potter books, but from a fan fiction story, which I actually referenced in the last episode. I will remind you that it is a explicit story, which can be found on Archive of Our Own. It's called Transfigurations, and all the information about that can be found in our blog post about the last episode. But in this fanfiction story, in chapter 15, Harry returns to Godric's Hollow, and he's never been there before in this version of the story. And he finds the ruins of the cottage that he was a baby in, and he turns it into a memorial for all those who had died in the fight against the dark. And in the end, for most of us, it's not glory that we want. It's love. Even if it's love that's imperfectly expressed. He creates this monument, and some parts of it are not that great because he is in an emotional state, and he's not doing his best work, and even if he was, it's not going to be that. The question of, would you rather have a huge and awesome headstone, or have someone who loves you and remembers you bring flowers to your grave every week for 50 years after you die, is kind of how I think about how do we remember people.
Mm-hmm. I also am really struck by the stories I've heard of people who have been to the Middle East and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is said to be where Jesus was laid, the tomb where Jesus was laid. And there's this magnificent tomb that is like the location of the building, and it's beautiful and adorned like we adorn so many things of our faith. And then nearby is this plain, quiet tomb that is probably actually more similar to Jesus' actual tomb, even if his was unused, and that it's just small and inconspicuous right next to all of the grand things.
Which reminds me of Indiana Jones. And is the goblet that Jesus would have drank out of big and flashy and snazzy, or is it a plain, common carpenter's cup?
Right, yep. And then that got me thinking about Voldemort and Bellatrix, who, like I just mentioned, right, they're put off into the side chamber when they're dead. And they're still dead, and their bodies will need to be dealt with, but they're not honored or glorified. They're just placed in a room. And I wonder, that actually seems really similar and fitting for how Jesus' body was probably treated. It wasn't glorified at the time. People were devastated. It wasn't a glory thing. It wasn't this special, beautiful thing. They weren't lifting him up at that point. They were just burying him and their hopes and their dreams.
And Good Friday itself is not about what happens next. It's about the passion. It's about Jesus' death and burial. But that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that we know what's coming next.
Mm-hmm.
And while Good Friday itself, the day of, is very somber, very quiet, very dark, it is not entirely without hope. For me, growing up, it was the one day of the church year where we never had communion. But that didn't mean that we didn't know we could have communion the next day. But I love the idea that sometimes, as much as we love our old traditions, we get to start something new. And it's such a relief. It's so refreshing. And I think that one of the ways that this is echoed in the Harry Potter books is that the way that the fans received the epilogue, which Ms. Rowling had told us she wrote right at the beginning when she started writing the books, and kept in a safe in her house. But she kept that, and she printed it just as it was originally written 7 years before. More than 7 years.
Except that she changed, like, the last line.
Right, she changed one line and that was it, but the rest was exactly the same. And the thing was, she hadn't counted on. The story she was telling over those years had changed somewhat with time, because the way that the world was working, the way things worked in the world, had changed. The epilogue didn't reflect any of that, because she had written it so early. And so the happy ending that she had originally managed for the story didn't wind up being the happy ending that the fans wanted, because the fans had grown up with the story, and it felt like it was an 11-year-old's ending to a 17-year-old story. And new beginnings are wonderful, but it seemed like instead of having a new beginning for the Harry Potter characters, instead we had a rehash of something old.
Yeah, which ended up being a perfect setup for Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which is a whole other thing that you and I both have our own struggles with, I guess would maybe be a fair way of saying that.
In any case, this podcast episode is long enough without going into that in detail.
Yes, it made me think about Jesus being put in a new tomb and the way that even without knowing it, maybe, right? Like maybe they just wanted what was newest and best that they could get for Jesus.
Sure.
But even without knowing it, they were the beginning of the resurrection, right? That it was this new thing.
Always being made new.
Hashtag ELCA.
For those who don't know, the church that we are both clergy of, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, has the motto of always being made new. So we like to bring that up whenever we can.
Well, thank you for joining us for this, hopefully not too heavy, but just heavy enough Good Friday episode of HP at Church.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily E. Ewing and Kaya Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HP at Church, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.